Orville, I want to turn back to you to try to get an answer to my original question. Oh, this has been a fascinating back and forth. I've really appreciated your views. Let me ask it in a slightly different way to try to elicit your response. What kind of China does America want and need in the world in order to stand up to China and get along with China?
Well, of course, America is also a very fickle country, an unpredictable country, and it's easy for us to think that it should act rationally, and maybe does act rationally sometimes, but it doesn't. I think, the ideal world was paradoxically and quite tragically the world we had, which was engagement. It was I think Henry Kissinger was absolutely right. He threw the switch. And he didn't call it engagement then. We didn't know about engagement yet, but it became that. And the conceit of engagement was, let's accept each other more or less, let's trade, let's exchange, let's try to get along and slowly see if we can't get on a more convergent pathway. And I think you all know that America actually, this was, I think, a really good example of American leadership. And I will remind you, after the Beijing massacre, what did President Bush do, who was at the initial, before we had an embassy, he was in Beijing representing the United States. He sent Brent Scowcroft to see Deng Xiaoping secretly. Didn't even tell Ambassador Jim Lilly that they were going. The transcript of that meeting is very telling, because what it shows us was Scowcroft really got berated by Deng Xiaoping, who actually I think is quite a hero. I don't want to malign him, but only to say that Deng saw the demonstrations as caused by the United States and was very abusive to Scowcroft, who was saying, please remember President Bush thinks of China. The China relationship is important, wants to continue it. I raise that only to say that I think the United States has gone the distance to try to find a way to do exactly what you propose, Kishore, which is to accept, maybe not completely, but to get along, work it out, see if the future can't hold a better future, a more congruent future. And I think what we see, if I may just quickly jump to the end here and then stop, is that in a certain sense, if I read this correctly, I think Xi Jinping has brought engagement to an end, sadly and tragically, both for us, for you, and for China. And I ask you why? How do you explain it? And that changes the game completely. So what are you going to do about it? What am I going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? What's the right response now that we don't have an operating system for any kind of as Hamid said, we're compassless. What's the answer? You tell me.
Could you actually talk to us a little bit about where you think the U.S.-China relationship could more productively go? I mean, I think, Orville, a lot of the points that you've made, and also Kishore, the points that you've made have really pointed to a very deep strategic mistrust between the U.S. and China. We don't trust each other's political systems. China thinks the U.S. is fomenting color revolutions inside the PRC because of American democracy. The U.S. thinks that Chinese techno-authoritarianism could spread throughout the world. We don't have agreement on what we are doing with regard to our Taiwan policy. We're definitely interpreting each other's actions as aggressive when we see our own as defensive. So how do we manage the strategic mistrust? And maybe if we can throw in Orville's layer, how do we do it in the Xi Jinping era?
Yeah, great questions. Strategic mistrust, you're absolutely right. And I can tell you that this strategic mistrust between United States and China worries the whole world a great deal. Because at the end of the day, no matter what you do, the reality is that China, frankly, has already emerged as a great power. I don't buy the conventional wisdom in the Anglo-Saxon media, which is, by the way, always wrong on China. In 1990, when the economists first predicted the coming collapse of the Chinese economy in 1990, the Chinese GNP was $360 billion. A few months ago, the economists again came out with a story saying the Chinese economic growth is over. But then it had grown to 18 trillion. It had grown 50 times after 30 years of predictions of the coming collapse of China. Why do I emphasize that? China's rise is unstoppable. And it's not driven by you or by me. It's driven by 1.4 billion Chinese people. And I'm sure you read the column by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times last week, in which he said, if 1.4 billion Chinese people decide to become prosperous, nothing can stop them. And the Chinese people have this great desire to do as well as the rest of the world. And so they have China, by the way, China's economy has serious problems. Property bubble, demographic challenges, lack of investor confidence. These are all real issues. But at the end of the day, what we have learned is that if there's one set of policy makers that seem to know how to fix their problems, gradually, it is China. Now, if you want me to answer your question directly, Orville, about President Xi Jinping, I want you to know that, again, I want to go back to my point of 193 countries in the world. Almost no other country in the world passes judgment on the quality of the leader that they are dealing with. They accept the fact that he is the leader and we have to deal with him. Good, bad, friendly, unfriendly. And frankly, I want to tell you this, if you don't mind, very directly. If you did a poll of 193 leaders and asked them in 2017, 2018, would you rather deal with President Xi Jinping or would you rather deal with President Donald Trump? I tell you, 193 countries would vote in favor of Xi Jinping. I'm serious. So when you emphasize that, it's a leader that's a problem, it's not the problem. You have to deal with a country. And I can tell you this, since I've spoken to many people, especially in third world countries, who have dealt with President Xi, they don't share your vision of President Xi. They see him as a sane, sober, rational, predictable leader who is advancing China's interests quite effectively. I mean, at the end of the day, you look at where China was when he took power, 2014, where China is 2024, it has come a long way. So whatever we do, we don't underestimate him or China. By the way, we also don't underestimate United States. I want to assure you that the respect for United States is deep and profound and very strong. But in the same way, there's also the same deep, profound respect for China. And we know we have to deal with these two great powers. And actually, we believe that the United States would be better off. Now, don't call it engagement, don't call it containment, just deal with the reality. The reality is that there is a strong, great power like China, and you have to live with it. And then figure out what's the best way of living with it in a way that enhances America's national interests. And I would say for America to defend its national interests is perfectly legitimate. Perfectly legitimate. But in many ways, the world would be happier that if given all the extraordinary challenges we are facing, for example, in climate change, you're the expert on climate change. the most sensible thing humanity could do is to tell the United States and China, please, we have a bigger problem coming. If we burn up planet Earth, we have nothing left to live on. We're destroying the only ship we have. Why don't we press the pause button on this geopolitical contest? Frankly, it's less important than the global challenges we face. So if you ask me what the rest of the world thinks, they actually hope that the United States and China could find ways and means of dealing with their differences in such a way that it doesn't destabilize the rest of the world and allows us to focus on what's really important that's coming in the future.